The military forces of the Rebel Alliance were fairly eclectic, with equipment and personnel drawn from various rebel cells and local forces. But despite the general lack of uniformity within the Alliance army, during the early Galactic Civil War, many rebel units adopted a common uniform and equipment set distinctive due to its black vests, teardrop helmets, and blue shirts. This outfit was iconic, but it also raises some questions. Why were rebel soldiers so lightly armored? Where did this uniform come from? And why did the Alliance adopt it? In this video, we'll be answering those questions as well as taking a look at the surprisingly deep history of the rebel uniform. Now, to be clear, the specific uniform we're talking about in this video wasn't universal among Alliance personnel. Rebel troopers on planets like Hoth and Endor wore completely different outfits that were much better suited for the environments they were fighting in, making use of camouflage, protective padding, and more specialized equipment. Rebel personnel from pre-existing rebel cells or local forces sometimes had their own uniforms, as shown by the Mon Calamari crew of Home 1, and many rebel personnel didn't wear a uniform at all. But a large contingent of rebel soldiers, including most of those at Massassi base on Yavin 4 and the security detail aboard the Tantive 4, wore the rebel uniform in question. It's become iconic as the rebel uniform, and it was the most widely used uniform in the Alliance, as well as the strangest. This uniform was simple, if visually distinctive, consisting of khaki cargo pants, black leather boots, a simple belt with a holster, and a few equipment pouches, a blue shirt, a black vest, and, most iconically, a white teardrop-shaped blast helmet. In effect, it was just a fairly ordinary set of clothes with a helmet and an equipment belt. The vest had some minor blast dampening qualities, and it also featured interior webbing for storing equipment and concealed weapons, but even so, the protection it offered was minimal, and it left its wearer's chest exposed. For the most part, what the rebel uniform offered was storage space. Between the webbing in the vest, the pouches and holster on the belt, and the pockets on the pants, rebel troopers at least had plenty of places to stuff their equipment, which we're sure is a great comfort when you're getting mowed down by blaster fire. The helmet was the only part of the uniform that offered any real protection from battle damage, and even then, the way it was designed was strange. Rebel trooper helmets were made of plastoid, the same material as Imperial Stormtrooper armor, and they featured built-in comlinks and a visor that could be flipped down over the eyes to protect them from bright light. They were downswept over the back of the head to protect the neck, but they left the wearer's face completely exposed. Similar to Stormtrooper and Clone Trooper armor, these helmets couldn't stop a direct hit from a blaster bolt, but they could reflect glancing blaster bolts, and they could also protect the wearer from shrapnel, slug thrower fire, blunt force trauma, and other battlefield head injuries, though only if they weren't directed toward the face. Even when the helmet's visor was deployed to shield the user's eyes, the visor didn't offer any protection against any other forms of battle damage. All told, while the helmet was at least a little more practical than the rest of the uniform, the protection it offered was almost laughably incomplete, and, like with the rest of the uniform, its main upsides were its secondary features, the comlink and the visor. Rebel troopers that wore this uniform were rather lightly equipped, especially in comparison to Imperial Stormtroopers. Now, Stormtroopers were elite soldiers, not rank-and-file grunts, and the uniform issued to Imperial Army soldiers was actually fairly similar, but even Imperial Army grunts were issued torso armor when they were actually dispatched into combat situations. The Alliance valued its soldiers' lives much more than the Empire did, as it had far fewer of them and needed every last one, so it's worth wondering why they protected their soldiers less. Rebel troopers that wore this uniform typically carried DH-17 blaster pistols, DH-17 blaster rifles, or A280 blaster rifles, which were also standard issue within the Alliance military. This, at least, was more easily defensible. While it might seem a bit ridiculous that the Tentai 4's guards were using blaster pistols against a stormtrooper boarding party, the Blastech DH-17 was actually pretty powerful for a pistol, able to punch through stormtrooper armor and low-level force fields. It was designed for shipboard combat, and it was a pretty solid choice for many combat scenarios. Blastech also made a blaster rifle variant of the DH-17, which Rebel troopers frequently used in other combat scenarios, alongside the Blastech A280, which was one of the best armor-piercing blasters available at the time. All three weapons were considered among the best money could buy during the Galactic Civil War, and they were also illegal for civilian ownership, forcing the Alliance to go through black market channels to get such large numbers of them. So, the uniform issue clearly wasn't a matter of the Rebels cheaping out. They didn't for the rest of the Rebel trooper kit after all, so what was the deal? Well, the answer is simple, though it only raises other questions. The Alliance didn't come up with this uniform at all. As the Empire itself often pointed out in its propaganda after the destruction of Alderaan, the exact same uniform was the standard for members of Alderaan's Planetary Security Force. But that was only part of the story, because Alderaan's PSF was far from the only one to use this uniform. During the final decades of the Galactic Republic, almost every planetary security force in the core worlds, as well as many others in the colonies and Inner Rim, used the exact same uniform, as well as many of the same weapons, the A280 blaster rifle among them. While the Republic allowed and even encouraged its planetary security forces to be unique, the most well-funded and coreward ones saw fit to coordinate and establish common standards for rank structures and equipment, and this led to many of the galaxy's local forces using the same uniforms and gear. During the Clone Wars, the planetary security forces were nationalized by order of the Supreme Chancellor after the Battle of Rendili, and they were rolled into the Grand Army of the Republic and the Republic Navy. After the declaration of a new order and the rise of the Empire, the PSFs were formally done away with, replaced with a galaxy-wide Imperial military. Some local forces continued to exist, and many of them kept using the same uniforms and equipment, but many others dissolved, and their surplus gear wound up on the black market, where the Rebel Alliance was able to scoop up massive amounts of uniforms, DH-17 blaster pistols, and A280 blaster rifles for a low price. Ironically, the Empire was indirectly responsible for arming the Rebel Alliance. With that said, the Alliance didn't start using old PSF gear solely as a matter of convenience. Establishing consistent, or at least widespread uniform and equipment standards helped the Alliance army look like a formalized, professional, and legitimate fighting force rather than a ragtag band of insurgents, contributing to the Alliance's narrative that it was a legitimate force fighting an illegitimate government that had illegally replaced the Galactic Republic. And while Alliance leaders were careful to avoid depicting themselves as a Republic in exile group to avoid parallels with the Separatist movement, the use of Republic-era uniforms firmly associated the Alliance with the Republic it wanted to restore. This history not only explains why the Alliance used these uniforms, but also why those uniforms were seemingly so poorly designed. Ostensibly, the planetary security forces were meant to replace the Republic Army and the Republic Navy, acting as standing militaries under the control of Republic sectors. In sectors that had problems with pirates or long-standing martial cultures, this was definitely the case, but in the regions where this uniform was popular, in the core, colonies, and Inner Rim, the function of the PSFs shifted over the course of the Republic's final centuries. PSFs in these regions almost never saw actual combat. In fact, Alderaan, which was one of the worlds whose security forces used these uniforms, had renounced war altogether and gotten rid of most of its military. These PSFs only served two purposes. They were for show, and they occasionally performed police actions. The first point was a common trend in core world PSFs, which were infamous for commissioning enormous battleships that, due to the limits imposed by the Rusan reformations, had limited hyperspace capability and very little weaponry. The rebel uniform was certainly showy enough. It was more of an aesthetic than something that was actually meant to be functional. But it was also very well suited to the police actions core PSFs were sometimes deployed for, and in the context of those sorts of assignments, some of the weird things about this uniform start to make sense. For the sorts of assignments these soldiers would get, extensive protection not only wasn't necessary, but it could limit mobility and prove more of a hindrance than a help. This uniform was lightweight, flexible, and didn't restrict mobility at all. It was even wide open around the face to avoid restricting the vision of the wearer. They provided a little bit of protection against light weaponry, because that's all many criminals in the Corps could get their hands on, and they focused protection on the back because the most dangerous encounters a Corps PSF soldier could expect were ambushes. Most importantly, the uniform combines these attributes with plenty of storage space, a blast visor, and a built-in comlink, which would be important both for police actions and for actual combat scenarios. The Rebel Trooper uniform wasn't unfitting because it was a bad design in general. The Alliance just used it for a scenario that it simply wasn't intended for. This uniform wasn't meant to be worn by soldiers engaging in frontline combat with a heavily armed professional military. Such a conflict was considered unthinkable at the time it was designed, after all. Still, it was what the Rebels had, and it worked just well enough for the Rebel troopers that used it that there was no reason to change it. After all, not even Stormtrooper armor was completely blaster-proof. Against heavy-duty frontline weapons, equipping an army in blaster-proof gear was prohibitively expensive even for the Empire, never mind the Rebellion. The key features a Rebel uniform needed were to provide utility and what protection the Alliance could afford, and this uniform did that well enough for those who wore it. And not all Rebel troopers did wear it. As we mentioned earlier, the Alliance also had more robust and protective outfits that they issued to their frontline fighters. The soldiers that wore this uniform were mostly stationed behind the front lines. They were guards at Rebel bases or aboard Rebel starships, and they weren't going to face off against Stormtroopers unless things got really dire. The Alliance gave out its better equipment to the soldiers that needed it more, and those that were in less danger of being shot got the less protective uniforms. But there's actually even more to this uniform than that, because thousands of years before this became the favoured uniform of many PSFs, similar uniforms were used by the soldiers of the Republic Army. After the formerly loose-knit Republic armies reorganized into a single, more cohesive force just before the Mandalorian Wars, the army adopted a common uniform for the first time, and that uniform was very similar to the one worn by later PSF soldiers and Rebel troopers. It was probably the inspiration for that uniform, in fact. This Republic soldier uniform, which was used during the Mandalorian Wars, Jedi Civil War, Dark Wars, and possibly later conflicts, was much more robust than the Rebel Trooper uniform, but it similarly prioritized maneuverability over protection, even for soldiers that fought on the front lines against the Mandalorians and Sith. Similar to the armor worn by clone troopers and stormtroopers, the base of the Republic soldier uniform was a flexible black body glove, but unlike with those later kits, this body glove was exposed across most of the uniform. A few sections on the torso and along the sides of the legs had extra padding, which was orange in color, and extra protection was present in some places in the form of a cuirass, gauntlets, boots, and of course, the helmet. The boots were armored, rigid, and went up to the knees, with full knee plates for added protection, and they were black with orange highlights. The gauntlets were similarly armored, apart from the gloves themselves, and featured knuckle plates but no elbow plates, and they were painted orange. The cuirass was the most dense piece of armor Republic soldiers wore, covering the chest, shoulders, and upper back, and it was painted in orange and gold, with occasional black stripes. Republic troopers wore a utility belt over this uniform, and they also wore a teardrop-shaped armored helmet, which sloped down over the back of their heads. This helmet lacked the visor and comlink of the Rebel helmet, left the wearer's face even more exposed, and was painted black, orange, and gold, matching the color scheme of the rest of the uniform. This outfit was more protective than the later Rebel Trooper uniform, but not by much. The body glove likely functioned the same as the body gloves of other uniforms, helping to insulate the wearer against skin contact poisons, extreme heat, or extreme cold, and acting as a compression sleeve to stem bleeding when the wearer was wounded. The cuirass, gauntlets, helmet, and boots provided more comprehensive protection, but not by much. They were resistant to the relatively weak blaster fire of the time, but they still weren't blaster-proof, and their main utility came in protecting the wearer from shrapnel and other such battlefield hazards. This outfit provided some protection, but not too much, and it left many parts of the wearer's body more or less exposed. This was because, like for the Rebel Trooper uniform, its emphasis was on mobility. Republic troopers were left relatively unencumbered compared to their Sith Trooper and Mandalorian counterparts, making them more agile in battle and giving them much more flexibility in close-range combat, which was common at the time. While it's a bit of a tangent, the conditions of frontline warfare during this period were also different, providing more justification for this style of armor. During the Mandalorian Wars and Jedi Civil War, modern blaster technology was new and fairly weak, and there were other kinds of weapons technology in active use that changed the calculus for soldiers trying to survive. During the Mandalorian Wars, the Mandalorians went into battle with overpowered weapons that were suitable for use in their own clan-against-clan combat, which not even the Beskar shell of a Mandalorian was guaranteed protection against. Getting out of the way quickly was a much better guarantee of safety against such weapons than any armor, no matter how heavy. During the Jedi Civil War, meanwhile, a new technology started popping up that changed the dynamic of warfare completely: personal energy shields. These devices were worn on the wrist and projected a form-fitting energy shield around the wearer, which would completely absorb blaster bolts and other forms of damage for a short time before burning out. While this innovation was pioneered by the Sith, the Republic soon developed its own shields as well, and the Republic soldier armor's relative lack of protection ceased to be an issue for the frontline squads lucky enough to get issued shields. On the flip side, while shields were impervious to blaster bolts, they were completely useless against most non-energy-based melee weapons. As a consequence, both the Republic and Sith made vibroblades and vibro swords standard issue weapons, giving their personnel a way to take down shielded targets without having to overload their shields first. As a consequence, melee combat was very common during the Jedi Civil War, and the Republic soldiers' equipment gave them an edge over Sith troopers in such encounters. While Sith troopers wore bulky armor that, while protective, heavily restricted mobility, Republic soldiers could be much more mobile, and their body gloves still stemmed the bleeding from lacerations. Of course, these ancient advantages had no bearing on warfare in the modern era, but the Rebel Alliance still had room to learn from the old Republic army. Against high-powered weapons like the E-11 blaster carbine, the standard issue rifle for the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps, maneuverability was often preferable to direct protection, and Rebel troopers' uniforms kept them plenty maneuverable in combat. It couldn't always save them from a squad of Imperial Stormtroopers, but it worked better than an attempt at replicating Stormtrooper armor probably would have, much as the soldiers of the Old Republic fared better with their lightweight kits than they would have with Sith Trooper armor. While the PSFs probably only based their uniforms on this Old Republic outfit for aesthetic reasons, and while the Alliance probably appreciated this connection to the Old Republic as well, Rebel troopers benefited from these ancient design lessons. They and the soldiers of the Old Republic were both fighting for galactic powers that were outnumbered and always struggling to stay afloat, with constant equipment shortages and little hope to prevail against the massive empires that opposed them. They faced many of the same combat challenges, and they found similar solutions. A connection much more important than any aesthetic similarity. So that's our look at the Rebel Trooper uniform and its surprisingly deep lore. But what do you think? Would you like us to do similar deep dives on other unanswered Star Wars questions you have? Let us know what they are in the comments section below. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.